The night my son handed me a document and told me to sign it, I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. I looked at him the way his mother used to look at me when I was about to do something stupid, and I thought, this is not my son. This is what she did to him. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years driving a supply truck for a lumber company up in northern Ontario, and before that I worked the docks in Thunder Bay. I'm not a complicated man. I don't use big words and I don't own things I can't explain. What I had, I built slowly, carefully, the way my father taught me. One decision at a time, $1 saved for every 2 spent. My wife Colette and I, we raised our son in a house on Ridgecroft Avenue in Sudbury, a house we paid off in 1998 and still haven't painted the same color twice because Colette always had a new idea in spring. She died in March 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. That is the part I cannot make short. That is the part that takes longer than I have words for. What I can tell you is that when she was gone, I was left with a house, a pension from the company, some RRSPs I'd been adding to since the 90s, a rental property in Garson we bought in 2004, and 41 years of habits built around another person who was no longer there. The grocery store was the worst. I kept reaching for 2 of everything. My son, I'll call him my son, because that's what he is, whatever else is true, moved back to Sudbury about 8 months after the funeral. He'd been living in Calgary, working in project management for an engineering firm. He brought his wife with him. They'd been married 2 years. I had met her at the wedding and once before that, at Thanksgiving, when she spent most of dinner on her phone and then told Colette the stuffing was different. Her name is Vanessa. I want to be fair. I want to be the kind of man who is fair. So I will say this. When they first arrived, she was pleasant enough. She helped unpack boxes. She made a comment about how the kitchen could use updating, but she said it in a light tone, the way you say something you're not quite meaning as a criticism. My son was happy to be home. I could see it in the way he walked through the rooms, touching things. He had his mother's forehead, and the way he moved in that house, it hurt to look at him sometimes. They stayed in the guest room for 3 weeks while they looked for a place to rent. 3 weeks became 2 months. I didn't mind. I'm not a man who minds the noise of family. The house had been too quiet. It was sometime in those 2 months that things began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was the way winter comes in northern Ontario. You don't see it arriving, you just notice one morning that the light has changed and everything feels different, and you can't pinpoint exactly when it started. She began talking about the house, how much space was going unused, how the rental property in Garson must be generating good income, how it didn't make sense for me to be rattling around in 4 bedrooms alone. These conversations happened at dinner, and they always started sideways. Something about real estate prices, something she'd read about seniors downsizing, something a friend's parents had done. My son would sit there eating his food and not quite agreeing, but not quite disagreeing either, and I would listen and say very little, the way I learned to do on the dock when someone was testing to see if you'd push back. I wouldn't push back. Not yet. The document my son handed me that night in November was a form authorizing him to act as power of attorney for my financial affairs. He said it was just practical. He said it was something they'd been discussing, he said. And I remember this precisely. Dad, we just want to make sure things are protected. I asked him. Protected from what? He didn't have a good answer. He looked at his wife, she said, You're getting older, Walt. She had started calling me Walt. My name is Wallace, and everyone who knows me has always called me Wallace or Wally. No one had ever called me Walt in 67 years. I said, I know how old I am. I didn't sign the document. I folded it twice and set it on the kitchen counter and I went to bed. In the morning it was gone, and no one mentioned it for 3 weeks. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. I understood now what this was. I understood what she was building toward. My brother-in-law, Colette's brother, lives in Sault Ste. Marie. His name is Reg, and he is 72 years old and still puts in a half day at his hardware store on Saturdays. Because, as he says, he doesn't know what else to do with himself. Reg and I have been close since 1983 when Colette and I started dating. He was the best man at our wedding. He was in the hospital with me when she died, and afterward he came and sat in my kitchen and drank my coffee and didn't try to say anything useful, which was exactly what I needed. I called Reg the morning after the document. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You need to talk to Jeffrey. Jeffrey LaRose is a lawyer in Sudbury. He had done Colette's and my wills years ago, and when she died he had handled the estate process. He's a small man, tidy, the kind who keeps his desk very clean and asks questions that sound simple but aren't." I made an appointment. I didn't tell my son. I drove to Jeffrey's office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I told him what had happened. The power of attorney form, the conversations about the house, the subtle, consistent pressure. He listened the way lawyers listen, with his face very still and his pen barely moving. When I finished, he said, "Tell me about your will." My will, at that point, left everything equally to my son and to a charitable trust Colette and I had set up for a youth hockey program in Sudbury. The house, the pension proceeds, the RRSPs, the rental property, all of it documented, structured, clean. Jeffrey had written it. He said, "And does your son know the details of the will?" I thought about it. I said I supposed he had a general idea. Jeffrey nodded slowly. He said, "There's something I want to suggest, and I want you to think about it carefully before you agree." What he suggested was this: we restructure, not dramatically, nothing dishonest, nothing that would harm anyone who didn't deserve to be harmed, but we would update the will. We would set up a more formal trust structure. We would document everything carefully. And this was the part that required me to sit with it. We would not tell anyone what we had done. Not because we were hiding something wrong, because I needed to see what happened next. I agreed. There is a particular kind of pain in watching someone you love be used. I want to name that, because I think people don't talk about it enough. You watch your child, the boy you taught to skate on the creek behind your house, the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from hockey practice. You watch him say things that aren't quite his own words in a voice that is almost his but not quite, and you feel like something has been replaced inside him, quietly, while you weren't paying attention. He wasn't cruel to me. I want to be clear about that. He was distant. He was careful. He chose her explanations over his own instincts, over and over, in small ways that added up to something large. When she said the rental property should be sold and the proceeds invested somewhere more sensible, he nodded. When she mentioned a retirement community in Lively, he didn't disagree. When she told me, at Christmas dinner, with my son sitting right there, that I should really think about simplifying, I watched his face and he didn't meet my eyes. That was the one that cut the deepest. Not what she said, that he wouldn't look at me. The rental property in Garson had a tenant named Lloyd, a retired school teacher who had been renting from me for 11 years and always paid on the first of the month, and once shoveled my driveway without being asked when I had a bad back. I had no intention of selling that property, but I let Vanessa believe I was considering it. I let her believe a lot of things during those months, because Jeffrey had said, "Let them show you who they are." They showed me. In February, she approached me about adding her name to the title of the Ridgecroft house. She framed it as protection. She said if something happened to me, it would simplify things, avoid probate, spare everyone the headache. She had clearly researched this. She used the right words. She was not stupid. I'll give her that. I told her I would think about it. I called Jeffrey that afternoon. He said, "Don't do anything. Let her ask again." She asked again in March. My son was there that time. He said carefully that he thought it made sense. He said it was what Vanessa's parents had done with their property. He said, and I could hear how much effort it took him to say this, "It's not like we'd be taking anything from you, Dad. It's just planning." I said, "I appreciate that. I'll talk to my lawyer." Something happened in her face when I said that. A flicker, quick, controlled. She smiled immediately after and said, "Of course, that was very sensible, absolutely, talk to your lawyer." But I had seen it. In April, I drove to Jeffrey's office again. We finalized everything: the new will, the trust structure, the documentation of all assets, the updated beneficiary designations on the RRSPs. We had a conversation about what the estate would look like, and who would receive what and under what conditions. Jeffrey made notes. His desk was very clean. At one point, he looked up from his papers and he said quietly, "You know this is right, Wallace. Whatever happens, you've done this properly." I drove home and made myself a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table Colette and I had sat at for 30 years, the one with the burn mark near the corner from a candle we forgot about once, and I thought about what properly meant. I thought about the document my son had handed me in November. I thought about Vanessa saying, "You're getting older, Walt." I thought about Colette and how she would have handled this, and whether she would have handled it better than I was. And I decided she would have, but she also wasn't here, and I was doing what I could. By June, my son and Vanessa were still living in the house. They had, by that point, given up the pretense of looking for a rental. She had reorganized the storage room, which was where Colette's things still were. She did not ask permission. I let that happen too. I am not going to tell you that was easy. I am going to tell you, I stood in the doorway of that storage room for a long moment, and then I went outside and stood in the backyard and breathed until I could go back inside and cook dinner like a normal person. Jeffrey had advised me to write things down. I kept a small notebook, the kind with a red cover, the kind they sell at every Canadian Tire in the country, and I recorded dates, conversations, anything specific. Not because I was planning to take legal action, because it was important to have a clear record, because clarity is a form of protection. The will reading was not something they expected to happen when it did. In July, I had a cardiac episode, not a full heart attack. The doctors at Health Sciences North were careful to explain the difference, but a significant event enough to keep me in the hospital for 5 days, and enough to prompt a series of conversations about my health that I would rather not have had. It was also enough to make everyone aware that my estate planning was relevant in a way it hadn't felt before. My son sat with me in the hospital. I want to give him that. He sat there and he was scared. Genuinely, the way you are scared for someone you actually love. And in those 5 days I saw my real son more clearly than I had in almost a year. We didn't talk about wills or property. We talked about hockey. We talked about a fishing trip we took in 1997 to a lake north of Chapleau that his mother had pretended to be annoyed about, but actually enjoyed. We talked about things that were true. Vanessa came each evening for an hour and spent most of it on her phone. I came home from the hospital to a get well card on the kitchen table and a casserole that Vanessa had made, which was thoughtful and also somehow felt like an opening move. 3 days after I came home, she sat down with me at that kitchen table, and she said she wanted to have a real conversation. She said she cared about my well-being. She said she and my son had been doing a lot of thinking. She said, and she chose her words with great care, that she wanted me to know that when the time came, when all of this was eventually dealt with, I shouldn't worry, because they would handle everything, that the house, the property, everything, it would be taken care of. She said, "You've worked hard your whole life, Walt. You deserve peace of mind." I looked at her. I said, "That's very kind of you, Vanessa." I called Jeffrey the next morning and I told him it was time. He had drafted a letter, formal, correct, the kind Jeffrey LaRose writes, inviting my son and Vanessa to attend a meeting at his office to discuss my estate planning documents. The letter specified that this was an informational meeting, that no decisions would be required, that it was simply about ensuring everyone understood my wishes in the event of my death. My son called me after he received the letter. He sounded uncertain. He asked if everything was all right. I said, "Everything is fine. Jeffrey just wants to make sure the paperwork is in order." The meeting was on a Thursday morning in late August. It was one of those days in Sudbury that could almost pass for summer in a warmer province. Clear sky, no wind, the light doing something generous across the city. I drove myself. Jeffrey's office is on Durham Street, 2nd floor, and when I walked in, his assistant brought coffee, without being asked, which I've always appreciated about that office. My son and Vanessa arrived together. She was dressed carefully, the way someone dresses believes something important is about to happen in their favor. My son looked tired. We sat down. Jeffrey has a particular way of beginning these meetings, calm, methodical, no preamble. He set a copy of the will on the table, along with the trust documentation, and he began to explain. He explained the structure. He explained the trust. He explained the charitable component, the youth hockey fund, which Colette and I had supported for years, and which was now formalized as a significant beneficiary. He explained the rental property arrangement, which was now placed in a separate holding structure with specific provisions. He explained the conditions attached to the residential property on Ridgecroft Avenue. About 15 minutes in, Vanessa interrupted. She did it politely, with a small, careful smile, and she said she just wanted to clarify, She said she wanted to understand how this compared to the previous arrangement, the one she assumed had been in place. Jeffrey looked at her with the very calm expression of a man who has spent 30 years delivering information people were not expecting. He said, "This is the current arrangement. I can certainly explain any specific provision in more detail." She said she just wanted to understand what had changed. Jeffrey said with the same measured tone, "Mr. Brandt updated his estate documents in April. These are his current wishes, documented and witnessed correctly under Ontario law." There was a pause. I watched her do the math. I watched her understand that the additions to the property title had never happened, that the power of attorney had never been signed, that the rental property had not been sold, that the will she had been making assumptions about, the simple, early version, the one she had perhaps discussed with someone at some point, tried to understand the contents of, was not the document in front of her, that the document in front of her contained provisions she had not anticipated. My son was looking at the table. Jeffrey continued, "He is not a dramatic man. He did not pause for effect or look up to gauge reactions. He simply kept reading, because that is what Jeffrey LaRose does. He reads what is true, at the pace it deserves to be read, and the room accommodates itself. The Ridgecroft house, held in trust, available for my use as long as I was living there, with conditions attached to any transfer that included a requirement for independent legal review and a waiting period. Not transferable by addition of a name to title without those conditions being met. The rental property, held in a separate structure, income continuing as established, with a local property management company now engaged in a formal capacity. Lloyd's rental situation unchanged and protected. The charitable trust funded, active, named. The residual estate, divided, with specific conditional provisions that I will not describe in full here, but which were designed. Jeffrey and I had been careful about this, not to punish anyone, but to reflect my actual wishes rather than the wishes someone else had been quietly trying to arrange on my behalf. When Jeffrey finished, he folded his hands on the desk. He said, "Are there questions?" Vanessa said in a very controlled voice. "I just don't understand why this wasn't discussed with us," Jeffrey said, gently. "Mr. Brandt's estate planning is his own decision. He is legally competent, and these are his wishes. He chose to share them with you today. That is the discussion." She looked at me. I said, "I told you I'd talked to my lawyer." My son still hadn't looked up from the table. I watched him, because he is my son, and because I had not given up on him even after everything, and after a long moment he did look up. He looked at me. His face was doing something complicated that I recognized from when he was 12 years old, and had broken a window with a hockey puck and knew he had to tell me. I held his eyes. I didn't look away. After the meeting, Vanessa walked out ahead of him. My son stopped at the door and turned around, and he said, quietly, "Dad," and then stopped. I said, "You can call me." He nodded. He left. Jeffrey walked me down to my car. It was still a good day, the sky still doing that thing with the light. He said he thought the meeting had gone as well as it could. He said, and I appreciated him saying it, that he thought I had handled a difficult situation with a great deal of clarity and patience. I drove home on Highway 17. I stopped at Tim Hortons in Capriol for a coffee, the way I always do when I'm driving that stretch. The woman at the window had a sticker on her name badge that said, "Happy to help," and she handed me my coffee with both hands, which I don't know why, but it made me think of Colette, who also always used both hands when she gave you something. I drove home and sat in the kitchen and drank my coffee at the table with the burn mark. Regs called me that evening. I had asked Jeffrey to send him a summary, just so someone else knew. Reg listened, and then he laughed. He has a big laugh for a man his size, and he said, "Wally, Colette would be proud of you." I didn't say anything for a moment. I said, "I don't know about that." He said, "I do." My son called me 11 days later. It was a Sunday, and he called in the morning, which was when he used to call when he was in Calgary, and we'd talk for 20 minutes before he had to get ready for something. He called without Vanessa on the line. He talked. I listened. He said things that were difficult to say, and I believe he meant them, and I am not going to repeat them here, because some things belong to the two of us. What I will tell you is this. He moved out of the house on Ridgecroft in September, not with me asking him to, not because of the will, or the meeting, or Jeffrey's letter, because he made a decision that was his own, in his own words, and whatever led him to it, it came from somewhere inside him, that she hadn't managed to reach. We had dinner together in October, at the house. He brought groceries and made the pasta his mother used to make. The one with the white sauce and the lemon. Not fancy, just good. We sat at the kitchen table and we ate, and we talked about things that were real. He has an appointment with his own lawyer next month. His idea. I still drive past the house on Ridgecroft on my way to the grocery store. Every time I park, I still reach for two of everything, and then I remember, and I put one back. And sometimes, in the fruit section, I'll stand there for a moment with one apple in my hand, and I'll think about all the things a life is made of, the choices you make quietly, the ones no one sees, the ones that don't make sense to explain but that you know, in whatever part of you knows things are right. I did not save my son. I don't think that's how it works. I just stayed myself. I stayed clear. I kept records in a red notebook, and I talked to my lawyer, and I held on to what was mine. Not because of the money, not because I was angry, but because it was the only honest thing I knew how to do. Colette always said I was too stubborn to be fooled. I think she meant it as a compliment.